In the year 1700, the average person in England consumed roughly 2 kilograms of sugar per year. By 1800, that number had tripled. By 1900, it had reached nearly 50 kilograms. No law mandated it, no government campaign promoted it, no single inventor changed everything overnight. What happened was quieter than that, and in many ways more profound. Sugar moved. It moved from palace kitchens to merchant tables, from merchant tables to working-class homes, and eventually into the hands of every man, woman, and child who could spare a coin. It didn't just change what people ate, it changed when they ate, how they rested, how they worked, and what they expected from a meal. This is the story of how an exotic luxury became an ordinary reflex, how sugar stopped being a reward and became a rhythm. To understand what changed, you have to start with what came before. For most of recorded history, sweetness was rare. It existed in fruit, in honey, in certain roots, but it was seasonal, expensive, or difficult to find. You couldn't simply reach for it. Honey was the dominant sweetener in Europe for centuries. It was precious enough to be used as currency, as tribute, as medicine. Monasteries kept bees not as a hobby, but as a serious economic enterprise. A jar of honey was a meaningful gift. In medieval Europe, the diet of common people was built around grain, legumes, salted meat, and root vegetables. Flavor came from salt, vinegar, herbs, and the occasional dried fruit. The concept of a sweet course at the end of a meal existed only among the wealthy, and even then it was treated as a spectacle, not a routine. Sugar was known. It arrived in Europe from the Arab world, carried along trade routes that stretched from the cane fields of Persia and India across the Mediterranean. But it arrived in small quantities at enormous cost. In 13th century England, sugar was priced similarly to rare spices. It was sold by apothecaries, not food merchants. Physicians prescribed it. Recipes called for a pinch the way we might call for saffron, not because it was flavorless in large quantities, but because large quantities were simply unimaginable. The wealthy displayed sugar at feasts in elaborate molded sculptures, castles, animals, heraldic symbols that guests admired before eating. These subtleties, as they were called, announced status as clearly as any coat of arms. Sweetness, in other words, was a performance, not a habit. Everything began to shift in the 15th and 16th centuries when European powers started to look beyond the Mediterranean for new ways to produce the things they craved. Sugarcane had been grown in small quantities on islands in the Atlantic, the Canaries, Madeira, the Azores, but the real transformation came when Portuguese colonizers carried it to Brazil and Spanish settlers introduced it to the Caribbean. The climate was right, the land was available in the brutal calculus of colonization, and the demand, once supply could be imagined, was limitless. What followed was a system of production that no pre-modern economy had ever attempted at this scale. Vast plantations, forced labor on a staggering scale, mills that ran day and night during harvest, ships that crossed the Atlantic in continuous rotation, loading and unloading tons of raw and refined sugar. The human cost of this expansion was incalculable. The transatlantic slave trade and the sugar industry were not separate phenomena. They were structurally inseparable. Millions of people were enslaved and transported to work in conditions of extreme brutality so that Europeans could sweeten their food. That is a fact that must sit at the center of this history, not be passed over quickly. But the economic consequence of all this production was simple. Sugar became cheaper. Not cheap overnight, not cheap for everyone immediately, but cheaper, measurably, consistently, generation by generation, cheaper. In the 1650s, the price of sugar in England dropped significantly as Caribbean production scaled. It dropped again in the 1700s. Each time, a new stratum of society was brought within reach of what had previously been an aristocratic pleasure. The timing of sugar's price decline coincided with something else entirely: the arrival of three new beverages in European culture: coffee, tea, chocolate. All three came from distant parts of the world within roughly the same century. All three were bitter in their natural form, and all three became almost immediately vehicles of sugar. This was not inevitable. In the Ottoman Empire, coffee was consumed without sweeteners. In China and Japan, tea was drunk plain. These were cultural choices, not chemical necessities. In Europe, however, the habit of sweetening took hold quickly and deeply. Coffee houses opened in London, Amsterdam, Vienna, and Paris from the mid-1600s onward. They became centers of commercial and intellectual life, places where merchants traded information, where newspapers were passed around, where deals were made over cups of sweetened coffee or hot chocolate. The coffee house was, in a meaningful sense, the first office culture, and its fuel was sugar. At the same time, tea was making its own journey. The East India Company began importing it to Britain in the late 17th century. Initially, it was expensive and fashionable. Within 100 years, it had become something else entirely. Tea became the drink of the English working class, and the working class drank it with sugar. This combination, cheap tea, cheap sugar, boiling water from a kettle, became the foundation of a new daily ritual, something that happened in the morning, in the afternoon, after difficult work, before difficult work, something that punctuated the day. For the first time in history, ordinary people were consuming sugar not occasionally, not ceremonially, but habitually, several times a day, every day. The transformation was quiet. It happened in kitchens, in factory canteens, in cramped city lodgings. No one announced it as a revolution, but it was. The Industrial Revolution accelerated everything. Urbanization pulled millions of people away from subsistence farming into cities and factories. With that shift came a loss of time. Time to cook, to tend gardens, to prepare food from scratch. The new industrial worker needed food that was quick, filling, and affordable. Sugar met all three requirements. Jam became a staple. Not the delicate preserve of aristocratic breakfast tables, but cheap, mass-produced jam made from fruit pulp and enormous quantities of sugar. Spread on bread, it provided calories, flavor, and enough sweetness to make a hard day feel slightly more bearable. Biscuits, sweet, shelf-stable, portable, were manufactured by the millions. Companies like Huntley and Palmer's in England built factories that shipped biscuit tins around the world. The sweetened biscuit, once a luxury, became a functional object, something you kept in a tin for when you needed energy quickly. Confectionery shops multiplied. Hard candies, toffees, and boiled sweets became affordable treats for working-class children. The idea of the sweet shop, a small store selling penny candies in glass jars, became a fixture of British and American urban life. And then, in the 19th century, two further innovations changed the economics of sugar completely. The first was beet sugar. European chemists and farmers, partly spurred by Napoleon's continental blockade cutting off Caribbean imports, developed the technology to extract sugar from sugar beets grown in temperate climates. France, Germany, and Russia became major sugar producers. Supply increased further. Price dropped further. The second was the refining of industrial processing. Mechanized sugar refining produced pure white granulated sugar in quantities that made it almost impossibly cheap. By the late 1800s, sugar in Europe and North America cost a fraction of what it had a century before. What had been a luxury for medieval kings was now a commodity available in every corner shop. The change in diet was so gradual that most people living through it never noticed the full arc. But step back and look at the century between 1800 and 1900, and the transformation is striking. At the start of that century, sugar was still a supplement for most working people, something added to tea, something saved for special occasions. By its end, sugar was structural. It was baked into bread, dissolved into sauces, stirred into porridge, added to canned vegetables, and present in almost every processed food entering the urban diet. Taste expectations shifted accordingly. Foods that previous generations had found perfectly satisfying began to seem bland, even unpleasant without sweetness. Children raised on sweetened foods grew into adults who expected sweetness. Adults who had grown up with little sugar sometimes found the new abundance uncomfortably intense, a detail noted by observers at the time, though rarely analyzed. What was happening was a recalibration of the palate. The threshold for satisfaction was moving. This is a pattern that nutritional historians have traced carefully. It wasn't a conspiracy or a deliberate manipulation, though commercial interests certainly played a role in encouraging sweet consumption. It was something more structural. Once sweetness became available and affordable, it became desirable. And once desirable, it became expected. And once expected, it became necessary. By the early 20th century, doctors were beginning to notice something else. Rates of dental decay had risen sharply across industrialized nations. The connection to sugar consumption was suspected and eventually confirmed, but the habit was too deep, too economically embedded, and too culturally comfortable to simply reverse. Sugar had become, in a very real sense, non-negotiable. Not because anyone had planned it, but because transformation, once it reaches a certain depth in daily life, stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like nature. If the 19th century embedded sugar into daily life, the 20th century industrialized the relationship entirely. The rise of packaged and processed foods meant that sugar appeared in places no one traditionally sweetened. Breakfast cereals, marketed aggressively to children from the 1920s onward, contained levels of sugar that would have been considered extravagant in any previous era. Soft drinks, which had existed in modest form since the 19th century, became mass-market commodities. A bottle of cola contained enough sugar to have constituted a meaningful treat in 1800. By 1950, it was something you picked up casually from a vending machine. Fast food built its flavor profiles around fat, salt, and sugar in combinations carefully calibrated to maximize palatability. This wasn't accidental. Food scientists understood the mechanics of taste and appetite. They understood that sweetness triggered particular responses, that the combination of sugar and fat created textures and flavors that were difficult to stop eating. The marketing around sugar was equally sophisticated. Advertisements connected sweet foods to happiness, to family, to celebration, to reward. Sugar wasn't just being sold as a flavor, it was being sold as an emotion. Children grew up surrounded by these messages. Birthday cakes, holiday candy, the ice cream truck, the cookie jar. Sweetness became inseparable from comfort, from festivity, from love. These weren't arbitrary associations. They were carefully constructed, commercially reinforced, and passed from generation to generation as though they were timeless traditions, when in fact, most of them were inventions of the past 100 years. Where does the story end? In some ways, it hasn't. The per capita sugar consumption in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Brazil remains dramatically higher than any pre-industrial baseline. The foods that fill modern supermarkets are, on average, far sweeter than those of 50 years ago, and those of 50 years ago were far sweeter than 100 years before that. But something else is happening too. In the early 21st century, awareness of the health consequences of chronic high sugar consumption began to shift public conversation in ways that the 19th century couldn't have anticipated. Researchers linked excess sugar intake to obesity, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and a range of cardiovascular conditions. Governments in several countries introduced taxes on sugary drinks. Food labeling became more detailed. Consumer interest in clean eating and reduced sugar diets grew. For the first time in centuries, the direction of the trend was not simply more. But changing a habit embedded across hundreds of years is not a simple thing. The food industry is large and adaptive. Human appetite, once shaped towards sweetness, doesn't easily reshape itself. And for billions of people around the world still experiencing rising incomes and greater food access for the first time, the trajectory that Europe and North America traced across the 18th and 19th centuries is now being repeated. Sugar remains cheap, it remains available, it remains, for many people, one of the most reliable forms of affordable pleasure. The story of how it got there, from a rare spice sold by apothecaries to an invisible ingredient in almost everything we eat, is not just a history of food. It is a history of appetite, of economics, of empire, of daily life. And it is, by any measure, still being written.